Welcome to session 3 of our SAT Virtual Bootcamp, which is on reading comprehension and strategies, strategies for attacking reading comprehension. And we are only going over that one section today, just because, with reading and answering questions and everything, it takes a little bit longer. So it's a full 2 hours of reading comp all day today. So as a reminder, this is the way the test is structured. The reading exam is always the first section. It is always 65 minutes long and always is 52 questions. Let's break that down even further. So there's always 5 passages. So with 52 questions, that means like 3 of the passages will have 10 questions and 2 of the passages will have 11 questions. So you'll be dealing with almost an equitable number of questions for each passage. One passage will always be a literary fiction passage. So those are your excerpts from a book or short story. And those are usually the first passage. And we talked about in the previous section that if you are less comfortable with the fiction passages, you can skip them. You don't have to do them first. You can save it for the last thing that you do. You will always encounter one paired passage. So that's when you have 2 shorter passages on the same topic from 2 different authors. They usually have a somewhat differing viewpoint on the subject matter. You will have another 1 or 2 passages that have an infographic. So infographics are any sort of chart, graph, picture that will go along with your passage. And then you'll have another 1 or 2 passages just kind of in general. And those passages, those paired infographic, all those passages will be in either history, social studies, or science. So one question I get frequently is, do I need to know stuff about US history? Do I need to prepare that before taking the SAT? Absolutely not. The information for answering the reading comprehension questions are all in the passage. So if there's a passage about Benjamin Franklin, you don't need to know anything about Benjamin Franklin than what is given to you in the passage. This is not about knowledge of a topic. It's about how you are able to read and comprehend a passage and answer questions about that passage. Okay, so don't feel like you have to do any extra homework on this subject matter. When you break it down, you should be spending about 13 minutes per passage. That means taking approximately 5 minutes or so to read and about 45 seconds on each question. Obviously, if you take a little longer to read, like 6 minutes, then you would need to take a little bit shorter on each question, a little bit closer to, say, 37 seconds. And some questions you'll answer faster than that, and some you will maybe take a little longer. But remember, that's an average. But if you find it's taking you much longer than, say, 7 minutes to read and more than a minute per question, you're going to run out of time. So it's really important to do, like we talked about in last session, timed sprints, where you can take 13 minutes, take one passage and all the questions, and time yourself and try to do your best to stay within that 13-minute time frame. And that'll start to give you a sense of the pacing that you need to take to be able to finish your full section. So there's 3 question types. The way that the College Board groups the questions are into information and ideas, rhetoric, and synthesis. The kinds of questions that fall under information and ideas, there's really kind of 2 main groups there: detail questions and inference questions. And these are really different from one another because of the way that you approach the kinds of questions. So for a detailed question, it's the kind of question where you can reframe it to basically say, what is the author saying according to the passage? It has very specific language. According to the passage, the author says. When it has language like that, it says, you can find this exactly in the passage. You can put your finger on it, okay? That's how I call it, is point to it. So detailed questions are the point to it questions. as opposed to inference question. And inference means that it's not necessarily written there exactly in the passage, but you can infer it through some of the things that the author has said. Usually inference are related to tone words. We're going to talk about tone words in a little more detail, but things like adjectives and adverbs, those let you know if there's a positive or a negative tone or things like that. And so inference questions usually have language that's a little more like the author suggests this, right? So when you see a word like suggests, then that means that it's not actually explicitly stated. So that the way the questions are worded are actually really critical for how you approach finding the answers. Okay, so it's really important that you're really paying attention to how they're written. A rhetoric question is basically your function questions. These are the why did the author say this question. So why did the author write this paragraph? Why this word? Why this sentence? Why this example? Okay. The way that these questions are worded are oftentimes something along the lines of the author uses this example in order to blah, 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 blah. Function questions usually have to do with like the context. So if you have an example, why is that example there? Well, what's the context around that example? That would give you the answer of why that example is being used. Words in context, this is a function, right? Why is this word being used, or what does it mean in this particular context? That would also fall into this rhetoric category. Next is your synthesis questions. These are your questions that are going to ask you to potentially draw comparisons. Any of your questions that ask you for evidence of why, those questions where it's like, you just chose this answer, and then the next question is, what's the evidence? Like, why did you choose this? This kind of synthesis, it forces you to kind of take what you've already learn from a previous question and synthesize it with an additional question. Anything that involves paired passages or infographics where you have to take more than one piece of information and say, how are these ideas related? Those are your synthesis questions. And those tend to be higher difficulty questions because they might involve two steps to them. What did the author say here? What does the infographic say here? How are those things related to one another? So synthesis questions tend to be the most challenging. When it comes to your subscores, when you look at your printout like you're printing it out, your score report, there we go. When you look at your score report that you get from the College Board, the subscores only account for 20 out of your 52 questions. So 10 of them will be in the word and context section. The other 10 will be in command of evidence. Unfortunately, they don't really break down further for you, the other 32 questions in those subscores. Rather, there's another section in the bottom that has like command of subject matter. So command of history, command of social science, command of sciences. And so each of the passage types will fall into that area, but it's really just telling you how many you got right in each of those topics and not as much on how you did on question types. So it's challenging because they don't break it down and say, oh, you got this many rhetoric questions right, or ideas and what was it called? Information and ideas, whatever, that I broke down on the previous slide. Unfortunately, they don't do that on the actual score report. So just be aware of that. Here is the approach that we're going to take with reading comprehension, the method. So the first thing that you are going to do is you're going to read the passage and take notes as you go. I'm going to show you how to take notes, and we're going to do a sample of that. By taking notes, I don't mean writing copious things on the side of your paper. I don't mean spending tons and tons of extra time, figuring out what is being written. Rather, we're going to use a method that I call signposting that is going to help your brain kind of trigger where different things are in the passage. It's going to help you be a much more active reader. How many people have read a passage through, gone to the questions, and the second you start doing the questions, you have completely forgotten everything that you just read, right? I'm sure many of you have had that experience of just like, it's like I didn't even just spend 5 minutes reading something. So the signposting method will help you engage more with what you're reading so that you're really kind of paying attention, and giving yourself, yeah, everybody, I've been there, I've done exactly, sometimes, all the time, yeah. So a lot of you have had that experience. So we're going to, if I really suggest that you try this method that I'm going to show you so that you can help engage with your reading and try to avoid that wasted time of, kind of in one ear, out the other. Or in the case of reading, I guess, in your eyes, and I don't know where it goes out, your nose. Read the questions afterwards. After you finish, you're going to read the questions and answer them one by one, and you're not going to look at the answers, okay? Because here's another thing that I'm sure I'm going to describe another experience you might relate to. If you read the answers before you look at the passage, what can happen is you set up a little debate. You start reading the answer choices and going, A sounds good. Oh, B sounds good too. And you kind of get these two little debaters, one on each shoulder, like maybe the angel and the devil. And they're saying, oh, A's right because of this, and B's right because of that. No A, no B. And you start having this little interior debate about the merits of each of the answer choices. That's another thing that really sucks a lot of time out of the answering process. So to help avoid that as much as possible, what we're going to do is you're going to read the question and try your best not to look at the answer. So you can even put your hand on top of the answer choices if you need to, just to completely block them from your vision. Then go to the passage and use the evidence from the passage to make a prediction. Now, for some questions, this is easier than others. I know sometimes it's hard to make a really strong prediction, but at the very least, you need to be able to aim yourself towards where is the evidence going to come from for me to answer this question. And then you want to do your best after you've made a prediction to match your prediction to the answer choices. Once you form that prediction and now you're just trying to match, then you're going to have a much stronger piece of evidence to choose the right answer. Okay, so that's our method for singular passages. When it comes to paired passages, the thing that's a little different is that you want to do each passage one at a time. So read passage one, take notes, answer questions about passage one, then tackle passage two, take notes, answer those questions, and then finish off by answering the questions about both passages. Okay, so here's what the signposting method looks like. This is something that I've created. Prior to working as an Education USA advisor, I used to actually teach standardized test preparation. And so this is a method that I came up with as far as the signposting pieces from working with students and just really developing and learning from reading so many comprehension passages over and over again, really starting to see what are the most important things that are going to give you the signals of where you're going to have questions along the way. So Jigyasa is asking, are you allowed scrap paper during the SATs? So your testing booklet is your scrap paper. So you are writing in the booklet. You typically don't get additional paper on top of that. But usually they try to make enough space in the book so that you can really write in there and not need like extra pieces of paper. Okay, so for the signposting method, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to underline the thesis. Now, usually a thesis on most passages is going to be the last sentence of the first paragraph, right? That's a pretty typical spot for a thesis. Even though you know it's probably going to be there, just underlining it is really going to help visually bring you right to that important spot. And whenever you get a question like, what's the purpose of this passage? Well, the answer is usually the thesis sentence, right? I mean, the thesis tells you what the whole passage is going to be about. So underlining that, kind of committing it to your brain as an important sentence also lets you know, I'm probably going to have a question about this, or this is going to be a key to answering a question. For your literary passages, there won't be a thesis, and we'll talk about literary passages a little bit later. Opinions, star opinions. I like to use an asterisk or just, 5-pointed star. So you're going to star opinions because opinion is when there's a shift in tone, or the author is exerting, something kind of importance. And so there's usually questions about opinions, and it could be, why does the author say this, or, something along those lines, usually function questions. So starring the opinions is a great way, again, to tell your brain, ooh, there might be something coming about this. You're going to circle transition words. What are some examples of transition words? And while you're writing those, Veronica's asked, are you allowed to use a highlighter? The answer is no. On the test, you are only allowed number 2 pencils. So I do suggest that when you practice, you only use number 2 pencils. I'm using color here to make the slide look a little more interesting, but the reason you're using a star or a circle or a square is that you need to use something, a visual shape that is different, because everything will be in pencil. All right, so transition words are going to be things that lead you through an argument, like the word however is a contrast word. And something as simple as an and or a but is a transition word, or it could be something slightly longer, like according to, or it could be like in other words, or something like along those lines. Salim has asked if you're allowed to use mechanical pencils. You are not allowed to use mechanical pencils. You can only use your basic run-of-the-mill number 2 pencil. I give out number 2 pencils at my fairs and events. So the next time I come to a town near you, make sure you pick up some of my pencils. They are lucky SAT taking pencils. I had a student report back. He said he did very well with it. So I'm just, it's only my survey was only of 1 person responding back, but I'm going to go ahead and use that as evidence that they are indeed lucky. The last thing that you'll do in signposting is you'll put a box around tone words. And as I mentioned before, that would be usually adjective or adverbs. It can sometimes be verbs as well. Sometimes verbs can carry a tone. So for example, if a sentence that's like, Jacob walked into the room. Well, that's neutral. There's no tone in that. You can't really learn anything about walked. But if we said Jacob stomped into the room, well, now that verb is carrying a tone. And that's where we talked about inference questions. What can we infer when we say stomped? Well, it sounds like Jacob is angry. It sounds like if he's stomping into the room, like he's making a lot of noise, he's, boom, 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 boom. So these kinds of tone words, as a reader, are telling you more than what the author is actually saying. Okay, so it's always important to put a box around those, because the other thing that happens with tone words is when there's a shift. So say you have a tone word that's positive, transition word, contrast, tone word, negative. So once you start signposting like that, you're going to start looking at things in a different way, in a more methodical way. Remember, these are standardized tests. These types of patterns come up over and over again. And so when you start to think of the reading as a little bit more calculated, particularly if you're someone who doesn't love reading as much and is maybe more of a data or math person, you can kind of calculate what to expect along the way here. Okay, and Laura's asking, why is it important to circle transition words? Laura, because anytime the author transitions from one thing to another in their writing, it's usually signaling something important. So, particularly something like a contrast, you would want to be paying attention if the author's saying, "While this one thing exists," contrast, this other thing could be true. Oftentimes, there's questions around those kinds of contrasts. Um, Lawrence asks, is IE or EG a transition? So typically those are shortenings that mean for example. And anytime you're dealing with a for example situation, circle it. When you see the words for example, for instance, your brain's going ding, ding, ding. I might get a question that asks me, why is this example being used? So absolutely, you could circle that. The other physical notes that you should be taking at the same time is that when you read a paragraph, you should jot down a little note on what the purpose of the paragraph is. This should only be a word or two, maybe a little picture, a drawing, something that is going to help you remember what each paragraph is about. Usually the topic sentence of a paragraph will do a pretty good job of helping you with this. The reason to do this is that the questions will sometimes say, like, according to paragraph 2, blah, blah, blah. That's pretty helpful. But sometimes it'll say, when the author refers to, this topic, detail question. And then you're going, oh my gosh, when did the author talk about that topic? And then you're scanning the whole passage again to try to find that information. So if you jot down the purpose of each paragraph, which they're usually pretty well grouped, if let's say it's a topic about the environment, for example, there might be a body paragraph about organizations that help protect the environment. There might be a paragraph about, threats against the environment. There might be a paragraph about, whatever it is. Like, I'm just making things up as I go along, but usually they're pretty grouped well together. So then you could just on the side, you could write things like threats, organizations. And you can also use, like I said, use abbreviations and things that are helpful to you. And purpose of the passage and the tone. So you are fairly likely to get a question about the overall purpose of the passage, the overall tone that the author is using. So it's a really good idea that as you finish, you just quickly jot down your own thoughts on why did the author write this and what was the tone, so that as you go into the questions, you have a really good grasp of what those things are, because you will probably be asked a question about it. Jigyasa asks, when talking about opinions, is it just the author's opinion? No, it would be any opinion that's introduced. So sometimes the author is writing not from their own perspective. They might just be writing something descriptive, and then the author may introduce an opinion of somebody else in order to maybe demonstrate a contrast to what the author is discussing, or it could actually emphasize what the author is discussing. The most important thing about an opinion is it always has a very clear structure. So if it starts with something like, I believe, it's my opinion that, I think, right? Those are opinions. So you have to look at the language that's being used to determine whether something is fact or opinion. All right, so having said that, let's try it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start with passages from practice test 1. So these should look familiar since we took practice test 1 on Friday. So this is going to be a bit of a review, but then after we I show you how we're going to do this, then I'm going to have you do a little bit of practice on a test that hopefully you haven't seen before. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read this. And then after I read it, I'm going to show you some of the marks. You can kind of, I know You can kind of mark this as you go. So like if you printed out practice test 1 and you have that nearby, maybe pull it back up in front of you again and try marking the passage using this method, or even just grab a piece of paper and maybe just make some notations as we go to stay engaged with this process. The first thing you should do is you should always read that little descriptor at the top before you read the passage. Sometimes the descriptor, the title, will give away the main point of the passage. And sometimes the information in there actually gives you, it might actually give you a lot, even that one sentence. So you can see this one's called Money Can't Buy Love. Asymmetric beliefs about gift price and feelings of appreciation. So that already gives you a lot of information about this passage, like once you've read it. I love that it uses the word asymmetric feelings. That really is a good summary. Asymmetric feelings is a really good summary of what this entire passage is about. Here we go. Every day, millions of shoppers hit the stores in full force, both online and on foot, searching frantically for the perfect gift. So a word like frantically is an adverb, right? That's something that you could potentially put a box around because it gives you the tone. Last year, Americans spent $30 billion at retail stores in the month of December alone. Aside from purchasing holiday gifts, most people regularly buy presents for other occasions throughout the years, including weddings, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and baby showers. This frequent experience, now I'm going to give you a little insight. The word this, although not technically a transition word, I always circle that word. I get so excited when I see the word this because I know there's going to be a question. So just circle it. We're going to come back to it, and you're going to see why the word this kind of is a really clutch key word that usually triggers some sort of question around it. Okay. So circle this. This frequent experience only when it's the beginning of a sentence, not all the this is all over, just the beginning of a sentence. Okay. This frequent experience of gift giving can engender ambivalent feelings in gift givers. Okay, ambivalent, that's a interesting tone word there. I put a box around it. Many relish. Ooh, now we're getting to tone words that are very positive. So many relish. And if a word is really positive or negative, you could put like a happy face or a frowny face next to it to really show or a plus mark or a minus mark to remind you of the tone. So many relish, smiley face, the opportunity to buy presents because, transition word, gift giving offers a powerful means to build stronger bonds with one's closest peers. At the same time, another transition, many dread. Oh, whoop, 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 right? That's a negative tone word. So we could put a box around dread. We've got a frowny face. So just like I was mentioning, we had positive word tone at the same time, negative tone, right? So there's a contrast happening here, which is very interesting. And we might have some questions about that. At the same time, many dread the thought of buying gifts. They worry, so worry is kind of another negative word, that their purchases will disappoint, sad, rather than delight, happy, the intended recipients. So you can see we made a lot of marks in the last couple of sentences there, and there was a lot of contrasting between positive and negative feelings. We come back to the name of the essay here, and we see, asymmetrical. So that's interesting, right? So we're seeing that kind of in this second part, this thesis sentence part at the end. So here's some notes that I went ahead and made on this paragraph. They pretty much demonstrate what it is I wrote. I did miss frantically up there. So, every once in a while you might miss a word or two. Frantically is one of those ones where it seems it's a tone word, but is it an important, it doesn't seem quite as important as the ones towards the bottom. I didn't have a frowny face, so I used a little cloud for the sad for the sad word. I also want you to think about, what would you say the purpose of this paragraph is? And I underlined the sentence in line 9 through 10. I felt that that was a really great summary of what happens in those following two sentences, and is really the kind of main purpose. Honestly, you could underline the whole second half if you wanted to, but that line 9 through 10 really seems to be the best thesis sentence here. So when you look at that thesis sentence, what does it really mean? And what I would write on the side is that it's about positive and negative feelings around gift giving, right? So plus and minus. And we saw that through the relish or dread, disappoint, delight, positive, negative, and it's related to giving gifts. Okay, so hopefully when you read this, you kind of notice that same thing. And then of course, as you get into the further paragraphs, it starts breaking down more and more about the feelings of appreciation and all that sort of stuff. Now, due to time, we're not going to read the entire passage. That would and passage map it. That would take way too long. But there's quite a few questions that are just about this first paragraph. So we'll just go ahead and answer some questions related to paragraph 1 before we move on to a different passage. So here we go. Question 11. The authors most likely use the examples in line 1 through 9 of the passage to highlight okay? So basically, this is when we relate to examples, this is why you can think, why is the author using these examples? What's the purpose of these examples? So when we go back to the passage, you always want to go back and look at what was in the passage. Okay. And we see lines 1 through 9. That was all the things that led up to, including weddings, baby showers, blah, blah, blah. And then right after that, that circled word this, I told you this was going to come into play. And here it is. This is it. Okay. What is the word this doing in the lines 9 through 10? This frequent experience. What is it relating to? What is it talking about? Well, this frequent experience is talking about all the examples and everything that came right before it. If you're using the word this at the beginning of the sentence, it has to refer to something you already just talked about, right? So whenever you get a question that says, why are these examples being used? And the next sentence starts with the word this, whatever that little summary is right at the beginning there, whatever that noun is going to be your answer. This happens every time. Yes, exactly. Exactly, Lawrence. It's telling us what the examples do. So that's why I got so excited when I saw the word this, because it's going to trigger you to go, my prediction for this one is this frequent experience of gift giving. Okay, so now with that in mind, we're going to take our prediction of this frequent experience of gift giving, and I'm going to reveal the answer choices to you. I want you to find the one that matches the best, and then I'm going to pull up a poll for you to make a match. Okay, and so I'll give you like 10 seconds to look at the answers, and then I'll bring up the poll. And what happens is, if you're still reading and the poll is up, you can, in the poll section on the site, I believe you can say, you can answer it later and you can keep looking, and then you can go back to the poll section to answer it. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, polls up. Okay, remember, you're trying to match our prediction that the examples were related to the frequent experience of gift giving. The frequent experience of gift giving. Okay, so most of you have So the answer for this one was A. So another way to say a frequent experience of gift giving would be the regularity of shopping for gifts and then giving those gifts. Some of you were kind of entrapped by D, number of special occasions involving gift giving. So these are the kind of like trap answers that are really close to the right answer, but it's different in a very fundamental way, and that it's actually referring to the special occasions. The examples aren't there specifically to show the number of occasions that we have to buy events for. It's more about the regularity of having to shop and the experience of shopping and giving gifts, less than just the fact that there's a lot of special occasions. Now, I know those things are close to each other, but this is how you can get easily pulled into a wrong choice that is, it's called a twisted detail. It's very close to the right answer, but it's just a little bit off. C, the anxiety gift giving can cause for consumers. Now, while there's some information there about how it can be hectic to shop and whatnot, that's kind of part of what's happening in this overall passage, that is not the purpose of the examples. So you have to make sure that you're staying on track with the very specific purpose, as opposed to just a detail writ large or an overall feeling that could be maybe inferred from the information that was given, especially when this was a very specific purpose question. Okay, so that hopefully helps you kind of understand that one a little bit further. A red herring, thank you, Ahan. So let's go ahead to the next question, which is one of the word and context questions. So you will have 10 of these along the way. So it's quite a large number. So usually like 2 per passage. And so word and context questions are as close as you get to vocabulary, but the goal here isn't to understand this as a vocabulary word. Like you don't need to know the exact definition of the word as it is in the dictionary. Word in context means it's actually critical that you do your prediction. You need to go back to the passage, read the word in context, and try to think of another word that could go there. And that's how you're going to get your answer. So we go back to line 10. This frequent experience of gift giving can engender ambivalent feelings in gift givers. So we're looking at the word ambivalent. So you don't even actually have to know exactly what the word ambivalent means, because after that, we start having those experiences of what ambivalence is. Positive, negative. Is it positive? Is it negative, right? Positive and negative feelings, or basically what was the summary of our paragraph here, is a pretty good prediction for what ambivalent means in this context. So for what is a word, what could a word be that means something like having both positive and negative feelings? Does anybody have a good prediction they'd like to share? Without looking at the answer choices. It's not a prediction if you've already looked. Mixed. Yeah, Leo, that's an excellent choice. That's an excellent prediction. Having mixed feelings, for sure. So yeah, mixed or conflicted. Fabulous. These are great options. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the answer choices and a poll, and I'll let you see which one makes the most sense. Ooh, all right. Everybody's getting this one right. Excellent work. Yeah, the answer for this one is indeed B. Great work, team. Great work. Yeah, so as you can see, that taking the time to make a prediction on this one made it very clear what the right answer choice was, as opposed to if you took the choices and tried to insert them into the sentence, you might start having that little debate about what one is right. So it's really important to predict on these word and context ones. All right, let's move on to number 13. These are number 13 and 14 is a detailed question, and then number 14 is one of those command of evidence questions where it asks you to demonstrate what line you found the information in that gave you your answer. Okay, so for question 13, it says the authors indicate that people value gift giving because they feel it. Okay, so the language is the authors indicate. Indicate is a word that says it's in the passage. This is a detail that you can put your finger on. So you need to go back and find the exact spot where the authors tell you about how when people value gift giving. So value and a positive, more positive experience, right? So what do people value in gift giving? Well, we can go back to the passage and we can go back to where we find our positive sentence. Many relish the opportunity to buy presents because gift giving offers a powerful means to build stronger bonds with one's closest peers. So in this kind of question, because it's a detailed question, our prediction should basically be the wording of this question, of this sentence that we just read. Okay, so why do people value gift giving? Well, it's a powerful means to build stronger bonds with one's closest peers. It's an opportunity to get closer to people, right? So that is our prediction here. And I wrote down the whole sentence, but obviously when you're making a prediction, you shouldn't write down an entire sentence. You might just kind of point an arrow to that spot or, jot down one or two words. It's a really great idea to jot down your prediction in some way so that you're, again, it's cementing it in your brain and saying, this is what I'm matching to. Now, command of evidence is going to be where was the evidence that helped us answer this question. So since we just put our finger on that evidence in line 10 through 13, if 10 through 13 is one of our choices, then that's what we're picking. There's no reason to go through and try to look up the other choices and see if they also give evidence. We found the evidence, we feel good about our prediction. The answer to 14 should be line 10 through 13, okay? So we'll start with number 13. I'll just put up a poll for number 13. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to read these and then I'll pull up the poll. All right, excellent. Again, we're getting really, really great response on this one. Well done, everybody. 100%. 100%. Great job. All right. So 100%, You all got that right. The answer to that is D. D absolutely matched our prediction best. D is the response. And as you saw, we had found that response lines 10 through 13, and that was also one of the choices for number 14. So we were able to get both those questions right and probably do that fairly quickly based on such a strong prediction. We're going to scoot forward and look at the, this one has an infographic that went along with it. So whenever you're dealing with an infographic, and in this case, it is a chart. So when you're dealing with a chart, you want to take a moment and really just look over it and try to understand what the chart's about before you answer any questions, okay? So the title of this chart is Givers Perceived and Recipients Actual Gift Appreciations. And when you see that chart, and once you've already read the passage, you're probably also going to take a moment and notice that this is information that was related to paragraph 4. So it's a good idea to kind of build some bridges with where this relates in the passage as well. So even though the kind of numerics here are not that clear, like mean appreciation, like how, like 5.5, 6, 6.5, like sometimes it's not as important to understand exactly what those exact numerics are. It's really important to understand kind of the relationships that are involved in this chart. So you can see that when it comes to less expensive gifts, the giver thinks that the other person is not going to appreciate it that much, but as they would a more expensive gift. So there's kind of like a real gap between that. So like a person who's giving a gift, you can see from this chart is like, ooh, the more money I spend, the more expensive it is, the more the other person is going to like care what I bought them, right? But then when you look at the recipient, first of all, you can see they're almost even. So, well, it's like that thought's untrue because the person who's receiving the gift is like, well, I'm going to appreciate it probably about equal. And even more crazy, it's like, actually, I kind of am going to appreciate a less expensive gift even a little bit more. So you can see just from the chart, if you take that moment to really look at it and go, okay, I can see that there's some differences in expectations between these two groups of people, right? So hopefully you're able to kind of summarize that and understand that a bit before you get into the question itself. That'll make sure that you do a better job answering the questions. So question 20 says, the graph following the passage offers evidence that gift givers base their predictions of how much a gift will be appreciated on. Well, just from me talking this out and kind of getting an understanding of the graph, hopefully you can get a good prediction on this. So what would be your prediction here? Just waiting for people to put a prediction in the chat. Here we go. Jigas is first. How much the gift is worth? Rodham puts price. Exactly. Cost, says Julia. Yeah, so how much it costs? Price. Absolutely. You're all getting it right across the board. So now that we've said that, go ahead and answer number 20. I'm going to bring up a poll. All right, people are answering. And we've got a lot of correct answers across the board. Excellent work. Yeah, so the answer for this one is indeed B. Once you predict cost and you look at your answer choices, B is the only one that says monetary value. So this is another question which once you've been able to take the time to interpret the chart, understand the chart, read the question, you should be able to get this one quite quickly if you were able to have a deep have an understanding of what that chart was about. Good job. Okay, number 21 is interesting because this is a question that refers to the chart, but in the end is not actually really about the chart at all. It's really more about what was written in the passage. So you can see that in the wording. The authors would likely attribute the differences in the gift giver and recipient mean appreciation as represented in the graph too. So it's referring to the graph in that the graph shows that there's differences between gift giving and gift receiving. But what's important is that the question is actually saying the authors would most likely attribute these differences too. So you need to go back to the passage, and we established paragraph 4 is really where this is happening. Go back to the passage, make a prediction based off of what the authors actually wrote. So I'll leave you with this little passage, and I will open up. I'll give you like 15 seconds to read that. I'll open up the letters. I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to look at that, and then I'll open the poll. Okay? So here we go. Okay, the majority of people are getting this one right, but we do have another kind of secondary answer choice that's getting quite a few answers. So I'll address both of them. It's in between A and D right now. Yeah, and Josh has got a pretty good prediction there. People are not putting themselves in other people's shoes, right? And so when you think about putting yourself in someone else's place and being able to understand where someone else is coming from, you have to like clarify between A and D which one best describes that. Is it being able to shift your perspective, or is it being able to properly understand intentions? So as it's described in this particular passage, A is better suited, right? Because it's talking about the ability to actually place yourself in the other person's position and see from their perspective, because you've been in that position before. You've given gifts, you've received gifts, so you should be able to have the perspective of each person. Okay, so that is how we use the methodology, and that's also how you can expect to maybe encounter some of these infographics. The next thing we're going to do is look at the literary passage and just see how to approach that slightly differently. Literary passages are, as we mentioned, usually the first passage, and usually a little bit challenging for most people just because of the number of characters and the fact that you have to kind of understand their intentions a little bit more. So in literary passages, tone words are super important, and really getting to the heart of intention is around those tone words, and you'll usually get a lot of inference questions about those tone words. There won't be a thesis, as I mentioned previously, so we're going to use our underlines to mark whenever a new character enters. Particularly if there's, 3, 4, 5 characters in a passage, it's helpful to start to underlining them so that you can kind of keep straight who the different characters are and what their different motivations are. Okay, In this particular passage, again, this is from your practice test you already did, so this should look very familiar. There's a lot of really helpful information in the little introduction prior to the passage. So if you would skip that, you actually are missing some helpful setup. So not only should you be reading that, but sometimes you can even take some notes in that part of the passage. So this one says the passage is from Lydia Montoya, The Strangeness of Beauty, 1999. So it's a more recent book or essay. Sometimes these books are from like the 1800s. So this will account for the language being a little bit more accessible in this particular passage. The setting is in Japan, so that's helpful to know. This is not in, North America, United States. So the setting is Japan in 1920. Okay, so even though it was written more recently, the setting is actually 100 years ago, right? So that should already give you a sense that, like, culturally, this is going to be very different than, Canada now. This is Japan 1920. So you can already start thinking about how things are different then. The next sentence even gives you a little more information. It says Chi and her daughter Naomi. So I already underlined both of those because those are two characters, and it's already giving you a relationship between those characters. Chi is the mother, Naomi's the daughter. They're members of the House of Fuji, a noble family, okay? So we know that the word noble means that they're wealthier, they have status, right? So again, this should already start to give you a picture of what their home might look like, and the kind of context that they're living in. So all of that will help give you some expectations as you start to read the passage. Here we go. Akira came directly. So again, another underline, we have a character that's being introduced right away. Breaking all tradition. Was that it? Had he followed form? Had he asked his mother to speak to his father to approach a go-between? Would Chi have been more receptive? So at the end of this paragraph, you want to take a moment and really determine what this paragraph is about. This is, to me, I wrote down that, okay, Akira, who I'm just going to put the letter A, there's some questions here, right? And it seems like he's questioning his tactic, the way that he approached a certain situation. Obviously, we're going to learn more what that situation is as we continue to read. He came on a winter's eve. He pounded on the door. That's a good example of a tone word, right? Pounded. If you just say he knocked on the door, that's pretty neutral, but pounded shows something a little more, right? It gives you some urgency. So you can infer that this is urgent in some way. So he pounded on the door while a cold rain beat on the shuttered veranda. So at first Chi thought him only the wind. Now, you might find that there's going to be some descriptive words like having a cold rain. I wouldn't necessarily put a box around something like cold rain, because even though it's a descriptive word, it's not really giving you a very, like, a detail that is going to be that relevant. You're not going to be asked about, was it warm or cold outside, right? It's just giving you some setting information. The maid knew better. Another underline, another character that was just introduced. She heard her soft scuttling footsteps. I put a box around that. Soft scuttling, again, like pounding on the door. Soft scuttling is a bit of a contrast. It's telling us like her movements are much more refined, careful. She's trying to, maybe stay a little bit hidden away from the family. She heard her soft scuttling footsteps, the creak of the door. Then the maid brought a calling card to the drawing room for Chi. All right. So there's the couple of boxes in the underline I had created for that particular paragraph. As we keep moving, Chi was reluctant to go to her guest. Perhaps she was feeling too cozy. She and Naomi were reading at a low table set atop a charcoal brazier. Again, something like a charcoal brazier, like You don't have to exactly know what something like that is. That's just a detail. Again, it's giving you more of a setting more than anything else. So don't get too trapped in those details. When you're thinking of what you're going to put a box around, you're not going to box the word charcoal as a descriptive word, right? So that can help you determine what details are maybe more relevant than others. A thick quilt spread over the sides of the table so their legs were tucked inside with the heat. Who is it at this hour, in this weather? She questioned as she picked the name card off the maid's lacquer tray. Again, another descriptive word, lacquer tray. That's not particularly relevant to helping us answer any questions. Shinoda, Akira, Kobe Dental College, she read. Naomi recognized the name. She heard a soft intake of air. I do put a box around a soft intake of air because there's a lot that's being said just in that little description, right? We can see, just try to picture that person, Naomi. She recognized the name and she goes. So there's a recognition there. The soft intake of air is it's demonstrating that she's holding her breath in a way, right? And she's kind of waiting to see the response. She then says, I think you should go. Okay, so in that section, I had put a box around, well, the word reluctant was another tone word, and heard a soft intake of air. Whenever you're dealing with a lot of back and forth conversation, it's going to create like lots of tiny little paragraphs or dialogue. And so there's no reason to do a paragraph description after each, little line. So when you're dealing with fiction, you'll want to just kind of pull some things together, and your notes will be for like maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs or a section of dialogue rather than each and every small paragraph. So for this one, I put, it seems like Naomi knows Akira, but maybe doesn't want Chi to know this. Right now, as you're reading, it's a little bit unclear what the relationship is, and that starts to unfold throughout the passage. So as you're writing this passage map, you might kind of revise it later on if you accidentally make a mistake based on an assumption that you had earlier. But in this case, you can already start to like get a small sense that she knows him, right? Just based on the response. Okay. So again, we were not going to read the whole passage here. This was just to kind of demonstrate how a literary passage looks different than, say, a history or a science passage. And look at this, the first question. The main purpose of the first paragraph is to. So when you take that time to really think about what the main purpose of the paragraph is, and you've already jotted it on the side, hopefully when you see a question like this, you can feel confident that you already are potentially ready with your answer. So we're going to go back to our passage map. This was a function question. Why this paragraph? And we can go back to what was written there on the side. My particular description was just Akira's questioning his tactic, questioning his choices, and you can even just look at the fact that there's a statement, and then the next 2 sentences, because the paragraph is short, the next 2 sentences are both questions, right? So when I say it's questioning its tactic, like that's very literal as far as the paragraph is concerned. So when we go to our answer choices here, I'm going to show you another technique that Yusuf's asking, shouldn't we box directly in line 1? Yeah, you could. I found that the tone on that was somewhat neutral, but like you can absolutely, it's an adverb. So like there's no right or wrong answers as far as like when it comes to tone words, one's like directly, there's some tone there. You can absolutely put a box. I might miss 1 or 2 that you would box, and it might be vice versa. So, go for it. The main purpose of this first paragraph is to, okay, so I'm going to do something that I call a verb scan, okay? This can be really useful in any question where the answer choices, they start with a verb and then move on to describing a maybe a more generalized noun. These question types can feel a little bit hard to answer because they're not so specific. So doing the verb scan first can really help you maybe cross out a couple of answer choices that appear wrong just from that first word. So we already determined that Akira was questioning, right? So when we look at the answer choices, we see the words describe, criticize, question, or analyze. So which verbs make the most sense here based on what it is we already predicted? So hopefully you would say question, because that is very specifically what I said. But also the word analyze, like analyze is kind of the same, same sense as questioning. Whereas the word criticize really doesn't have any place here whatsoever. Criticizing and questioning are not the same thing. And then describe also is a little too, it doesn't have the same sense. To describe something and to question something are not quite the same thing. So I would go ahead and cross out A and B. If you don't feel comfortable doing, crossing out 2 for now, you can always keep it and put a little question mark by it. But C or D right now have the strongest match to what we already discussed. So then that brings us to the second part, which, as I mentioned, is kind of like a more general noun. So would this be questioning, is it a suggestion or is it a reaction? So from here, I'm going to let you answer a poll. Ooh, it's pretty even between C or D. A suggestion or a reaction? This is really challenging because, again, it's very general. So you have to think about, and I can go back to the passage again for you just to be able to see it. You have to really think about what's happening here. What is Akira doing? Is he questioning a suggestion? A suggestion is usually something that would have come from somebody else. Did somebody suggest something to him? He's questioning that. Or is he suggesting a reaction, reaction potentially of himself or of others? You guys are pretty 50-50 almost on this one. The answer is, in this case, D, right? Because the reaction was from both his own parents and from Chi, right? The parent of Naomi. This one's definitely a higher difficulty kind of question. So I know we only did one on that one and we did a harder one, but you really do have to use your passage map and really make a good prediction. Use your verb scan to try to do your best to get to the right answer on that one. All right, so what we're going to do next is I'm going to share with you the practice test 10. So if you go into the handouts section, so remember the handouts are right above the chat function. So go into the handouts and you're going to see practice test 10. You can download now that practice test. So I'm going to give you a few moments to get a hold of that test. And then I will set a timer for 7 minutes to read. So now, before I talked about optimally, you would spend maybe close to 5 minutes reading. So this is your first time considering the signposting method. So I'm going to give you a full 7 minutes just to really feel like what the kind of longer end of reading a passage would feel like. If there's a way for you to take notes directly on the passage, then do that. Like if you have a tablet where you can draw on it, or if you have a program where you can, it's a PDF, maybe you could do an edit PDF or something. I know that's kind of clunky, but do your best. I know it's not going to be the easiest. Or even just maybe with a piece of scrap paper, you can kind of draw on the paper where you would take notes directly on the test if you had it printed in front of you. Okay, so just do your best with the tools that you have immediately available. Okay, are we ready to do our 7 minutes? Who's ready? How many questions? So Leo, I just want you to read right now. Don't do any questions yet, okay? 7 minutes to read, no questions. We're gonna do the questions together, okay? So try not to, I know it's hard, but try not to look at the questions. Definitely don't look at the answers, okay? Because we wanna try to do our method together. But thank you for asking that question. Okay, here we go. I set my timer for 7 minutes. Oh yeah, which one are you reading? That's another important thing to tell you. We're not going to do the first passage because the first passage is the literary fiction passage. So I want you to do this passage, the second passage, the one that is about how scientific innovation increased efficiency and good intentions. Anyways, my little video is right on top of it. It's hard for me to read. So you're going to read the second passage, and here's the signposting information, okay? Yep, I'll put those up there for reference. Your 7 minutes begins right now. Oof. All right, time is up. That was 7 minutes. How did that feel? Go ahead in the chat. You can say, did you finish reading in 7 minutes and hopefully taking some notes? Did it feel fast? Did it feel slow? So again, 7 minutes would be kind of the longest that you would be aiming for. And then hopefully as you practice, you'll be able to get a little bit quicker than that. Okay, so maybe you felt like that was pretty good. All right, good. Like I said, you're aiming for around 5 minutes or as close to that as possible. Okay, so hopefully as you were making your passage map, you also remember you wanted to do the purpose of the passage and the tone. So let's just take a moment to think about what those things are. So maybe you could write that there in the chat. What did you feel the purpose of the passage was and the tone of the author? And when we say tone of the author, we mean things like, was this just descriptive, like a fairly neutral tone, writing it like it's an entry for Wikipedia or something like that? If you ever see the word encyclopedia, that's what Wikipedia was when it was in books. Every once in a while that comes up on an old SAT. I've actually had students ask me what an encyclopedia is. So it is a descriptive kind of book. Another kind of tone could be persuasive or argumentative, could be positive, it could be negative, right? So there's the tone has a lot to do with just the way the author is framing their argument or framing just the writing in general. Okay, so what did you put down for the purpose of the passage, the tone of the passage? Curious to see your responses. Okay, Salim says, there was a lot of negative connotation or tone toward the transit system, which serves to emphasize the conclusion later made of how traffic congestion increases with roads. Okay, so that's a good start. I want you to think about condensing that a little bit. So think about the purpose of the passage and maybe a way to condense that down into something fairly short, something close to what would be around the thesis sentence or just like the main 5-6 words of what the passage was about. And then of course the tone, you put negative connotation. I would say another way to say that might be argumentative, right? Like for the tone. Laura says the author isn't satisfied how we currently are dealing with traffic. That's true. That's a true statement. But maybe is there an even better way you can summarize the purpose? Min says the tone is critical and persuasive. Excellent, Min. Yes, absolutely. Critical of how things currently are, persuasive to the author's specific argument, right? Absolutely. Very good. Matthew says the tone, it's argumentative, absolutely, and argumentative against the transit system. Now, make sure that you're a little bit clearer when you say transit system, right? Because when you say the transit system, it sounds like you might be talking about buses or trains. This author has a very specific, there's something very specific about transportation that the author is focused on. Okay, negative connotation, trying to argue that the traffic situation is not good, very critical. Okay, everyone's calling it the traffic situation. I want you to be even more specific because the author's more specific than that. Are we talking about trains? Are we talking about buses? Are we talking about planes? I know someone's going to put it in here. There's a little bit like I have a little lag, so I ask a question, then I have to wait a few seconds. Cars! There we go, Chigasa. Exactly, it's about cars. Okay. Yeah, the methods were exactly, Joy, you've got it. The methods were trying to reduce congestion. Well, you said actual encourage driving. I think you meant discourage driving, right? So the author is specifically arguing against building infrastructure for cars. The author is saying that we're making things too easy for drivers. We're doing too much to support making driving easy. And the author wants to make it more difficult for drivers to encourage them to take other kinds of transportation, right? So very good, very good. So it's important when you're summarizing that you don't go broader than what the actual issue is, right? If you talk about transit writ large, it's not totally what the author is talking about here. You want to be as specific as the author is being, so that when you get a question about the purpose of the passage, that you're able to best create a match. Okay, so here's the first paragraph. Again, we're not going to read the entire thing together. I'm just going to show you how I passage map the first paragraph, and you can see if yours is somewhat similar to that. You can see there's a lot of circling here. There was quite a few transitions, particularly towards the end of the passage. There was a really good opinion that was thrown in towards the end there, and I underlined 2 parts to be my thesis. I was really wild with that. The reason I did that is because I felt like, yes, the last sentence was thesis worthy, but there was a sentence about halfway through that also did a really good job of summarizing the main point of this passage. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we will get to the questions. Building a good transit isn't a bad idea, but it can actually backfire if the new trains and buses merely clear space on the highway lanes for those who would prefer to drive, a group that, historically, has included almost everyone with access to a car. So right there we have a contrasting statement right off the bat. To have environmental value, new transit has to replace and eliminate driving on a scale sufficient to cut energy consumption overall. That means that a new transit system has to be backed up by something that impels complementary reductions in car use, say the physical elimination of traffic lanes or the conversion of existing roadways into bike or bus lanes, ideally in combination with higher fuel taxes, parking fees, and tolls. So the reason why I included an opinion star there is because of the word ideally. The word ideally is showing that this is the author saying that they think that this is the best way to do something. Ideally, it would be done this way. That is the author's opinion, not necessarily the wider range of opinions. And then this is where we start to get into a lot of transition words. And when we see all those transition words, we know that we're kind of treading into territory that might be rife with questions. Okay, needless to say, those ideas are not popular, but they're necessary because you can't make people drive less in the long run by taking steps that make driving more pleasant, economical, and productive, right? Okay, so we learn in the ending portion there some important information. The author says, the ideas are not popular. When you use a transition like needless to say, it means that like, these ideas aren't popular. It's needless to say because you already kind of know that from what I've already written here, right? But contrasting word, they're necessary because cause and effect word, right? So anytime you read one of these transitions, I want you to not just be reading the word because. I want you to be circling and reading cause and effect, right? You circled the word but, you're circling contrast here, okay? So anytime you do that, just make that little notation as you're making the motion. All right. Matthew's saying, shouldn't there be one thesis though? I mean, so of course, like if you're writing a paper and like technically the last sentence is the one thesis, I also chose to underline that middle sentence because I felt like it did a really good job of also summarizing the main point of the passage. I felt like it was kind of as important almost as that thesis sentence. So yeah, technically the last sentence is the only thesis sentence. The good news about signposting is when you make your own rules, you can also kind of bend the rules in ways that make sense so that your signposting is helpful for you, right? So remember, this is just what I've created, and I would love for you to implement this, but you can also change it, shift it. You can turn your circles into squiggly lines if you want to, right? So take what I'm giving you and make it your own, and make sure that you're kind of doing this in a way that's the most useful for you. Yeah, you're welcome, Matthew. All right, so the way that I summarize this passage, and maybe your summary is similar, is the need to cut drivers while adding transit alternatives, right? So that's kind of what I went with here. I'm assuming your passage map must look something similar to that. So let's go ahead. Now we can look to the questions. Oh, what do you know? The first question, what's the main purpose of the passage? We already just did this in the chit chat, all right? So we talked about this. It was an argument to try to take cars off the road, to improve transit and the environment. So hopefully, I'm not going to put anything else here. I'm going to let you use what we wrote in the chat, your own passage map, to make your prediction. I'm going to pull up the questions now, and I'm going to let you read them. Well, you should have them in front of you as well, so I'll put up the poll right away because you can look at them in your answer sheet. Here we go. Now, I would encourage you to think about verb scans again, right? And remember the tone of the passage. The verbs that are being used need to also take into consideration the tone of the author. All right, we're a little bit all over the board here. I think we know everybody's pretty much agreed that the answer is not B, because B is kind of opposite of the argument here. So just when we're doing just off of verb scan alone, you can put in the chat, which verb matches best? Like if you were going to, instead of reading A, B, C, D all the way through, if you were to just read the verbs and go directly to the verb that matches the best and start with reading that one to see if it matches, which word makes the most sense here? Provide, dispute, discuss, or argue? Right, argue. You all use, when we were talking about the tone, you all use the word argument. Provide an argument. That was already something that you had indicated. So when we are already, if you're doing that little scan and you're going, ooh, the word argue is enticing to me, that one already looks the most correct. Then you go ahead and read the rest of it. Argue that one way to reduce the negative environmental impacts of traffic is to make driving less agreeable. Well, that sounds pretty much like what you had just said in the chat. So the answer to this one is absolutely D. Okay, so again, you have to remember we're looking at the main purpose of the passage, and if you want to go back to your thesis statement at the bottom there, the main thesis statement, the last statement there is, you can't make people drive less in the long run by taking steps that make driving more pleasant, economical, and productive. Another word for more pleasant would be the word agreeable, right? So that D also does the best job of kind of reframing the thesis sentence, okay? So you always want to go back to your underlined portions and your summary of the tone. And between those two things, we got D as our right answer. All right. Let's move on to our next question, number 12. Okay, so when you're dealing with one of these ones where it says which of the following is the best choice, it's a little bit harder to make a prediction, right? So you kind of have to use what's given to you at this point. You can't predict when it says, choose something from below. So this would be a situation where prediction is a little bit more challenging. So I went ahead and just made those options already available. So which choice best supports the idea that the author assumes that, all things being equal, people would rather drive than take mass transit? Okay, so this is specific evidence. You need to be able to go to this, this line in this space, and it needs to exactly be the evidence of this sentence. All things being equal, people would rather drive. Okay, so where does the author say this, basically this exact thing, that people prefer to drive when it's, being made really easy for them to do? I'm going to start the poll. Okay, the majority of people are getting this one correct, but there is a bit of spread among the choices. We've got more than 50% getting the correct answer, and the rest are kind of spread. So this is, somebody had asked me a question in the Q&A chat of, are the questions usually in order of the passage? And they tend to be somewhat in order. The challenge is when you have questions like this is the second question, and obviously it's referring from lines 1 all the way down to lines 22. So they're not going to put it always exactly in order. Otherwise, it would be a dead giveaway as to which line is going to be the correct one, right? But as you can see, all the lines it references are within the first kind of 2 paragraphs, I think. So, it's within the right frame of reference. So the answer to, are the questions in order? Sort of, but you might get some curveballs here and there. So don't just assume they're in exact order. Okay, for the most part, most people got this one right. The answer to this one is A. And when we go back to the passage, I'll go back to the passage so you can see the line reference there, and I'll read it back. Building good transit isn't a bad idea, but it can actually backfire if the new trains and buses merely clear space on the highway lanes for those who would prefer to drive. A group that historically has included almost everyone with access to a car. So that's just, again, this is like a different way to say, like, if you have access to a car, historically you will drive. So all things being equal, if you have a car, you will use it, right? So those are just multiple ways to say the exact same thing. All right, we've got another word in context. And in this case, the word is 2 words backed up. So we should go directly to the line reference, line 9, and try to predict another word that makes sense there. That means that a new transit system has to be backed up by something that impels complementary reductions in car use. Okay, let's go ahead and put a prediction in the chat. Hopefully you haven't looked at the answer choices yet. I would love a prediction before you have the actual answer choices in front of you. Although I'm sure some of you might predict the answer choice. Supported. Yeah, I have to be honest, before I looked at the answer choices, I also said supported by as my prediction. And when we look at our answer choices, sorry, I accidentally circled it already, but bam, we've got supported as a choice. So sometimes, and it's so rewarding, sometimes when you make a prediction, it's the exact thing. And when you get there, you just get to circle it and move on and give yourself more time on another question. So good job. If you truly chose supported before you looked at your answer choices, then you had the distinct joy of predicting exactly right. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one more. After we do this one, I'm going to have you finish the rest of the questions on your own, okay? And then we will come back together and go over, for whatever time we have left, we'll go over maybe one or two based on which ones you want a little bit of guidance on. Question 14 is, in the first paragraph, the author concedes that his recommendations are. Okay, so it's letting you know it's in the first paragraph. It's telling you that the author concedes something, so it's a direct reference. This is a detail question, right? And so we need to go to the spot in that first paragraph where the author is saying that I concede that my recommendations are. So I acknowledge that there's something about these recommendations that what, right? So when we go back to the passage, and we can go right to that opinion. So if you aren't sure where to go, this is where your signposting is really helpful, because you go back to the first paragraph, and you're going, oh, where do I start? Well, go to your opinion, go to that space, go to all those circles there at the bottom. Typically the spot where maybe you kind of noticed the most opinions or transitions, things like that, is also going to be the space where you might find the answer to a question like this. And when we go back to that space, we see that the author says that some examples would be the physical elimination of traffic lanes, conversion of existing roadways into bike buses and lanes. Ideally, that was the opinion, in combination with higher fuel taxes and parking fees and tolls. Transition, needless to say, these ideas are not popular, right? And so right there in that spot, that would be a concession, right? That's the author saying, I understand I just made a bunch of examples that a lot of people aren't going to like. I concede that I understand that I'm making an argument that might not be a popular argument, okay? So having said that, I think that these ideas are not popular is a pretty good prediction for this question. Okay, so I just went ahead and wrote not popular. So again, when you're making a prediction, I really suggest writing it down, something like not popular in this case, right over your question, so that as you look at your answer choices, you're still reminding your brain what it is you're looking for. All right, on to the answer choices. And I'll pull the poll. You're doing a really great job. More than 90% of you are getting this one right. This is a very strong match. So right now, most people are getting this one right, but it's between two answer choices, which are B and C. And B and C are very similar to each other. So I can see, if you pick the wrong one, why. The wrong answer choice has a very specific detail to it that is a twist, and it is outside what is being said in this sentence. It's you reading it and taking this a step beyond what is actually written in the passage. This is a detail question. When you put your finger on it and you said, this is the answer, it needs to match. It needs to not go that extra step past, right? So, yeah, exactly. Salim, you nailed it. Experts. So in answer choice C, it says it's strongly opposed by experts. There was nothing in that piece that said that there was some sort of strong opposition by experts. That is out of the scope of what's there in the passage. The answer choice for this one is B. So always be on the lookout for answer choices that just take the information a step a little too far than what was actually written there. Your prediction was, this is not a popular idea. The answer choice is, it's not widely supported. Widely supported by who? People, general people, right? As opposed to C, which says only experts, which is too narrow and is not necessarily what the author was saying. All right, so I'm going to give you 4.5 minutes for you to finish the rest of the questions on your own. And I'll also put up a poll. So when you finish those questions, I'm going to put up the poll and see, you can say which one or more than one that you would like us to go over with our last. We'll have about 6 minutes left. So I think we'll be able to tackle 1 or 2 more questions with that time. Okay, your 4.5 minutes begins now. Okay, and that was time. Hopefully you were able to get through all the rest of the questions. I'm now, oh, I forgot to put up the poll. I'm now going to put up the poll of which question would you most like to go over? So now that you've finished those questions, which one did you find particularly difficult or that you would really like us to do together? Okay, so far, overwhelmingly, questions 15 and 16 are being voted for. So we'll go ahead and do those last two questions. And then I think we've got 6 minutes left. So I think we can do those last two questions and then we will call it a day. All right. So I've included the rest of the passage here so we can go back and refer to it as needed. There was some pretty insane looking charts on this one, so I'm sure that was probably a little overwhelming. As I previously mentioned, it's really important to just take a moment to really understand what you're looking at when it comes to these charts so that you can answer the question as best as possible. All right, so for number 15, based on the passage. So when we have based on the passage, sometimes that can denote a detailed question, but we need to read further just to make sure. All right, so based on the passage, how would the author most likely characterize? Ooh, most likely characterize. That's an inference question, okay? How would the author most likely characterize many attempts to improve traffic? Now, this is one of those questions where, unfortunately, they're not giving us line references or a paragraph. And so this one becomes a little more challenging because you need to rely on your passage map to choose, okay, which paragraph is the best paragraph? And go ahead in the chat so you can help me, indicate which one's going to be best here. Which paragraph's the best paragraph? That is discussing ways that people have attempted to improve traffic. So what paragraph should we be going to at this point? Based on how, we can also kind of use based on how we're going through the questions, it might kind of be still sequentially, maybe around the second paragraph, but you do need to rely on your passage map to make sure that's exactly where we're headed on this one. One of the reasons it doesn't give you an exact space is because you can see question number 16 it's a best evidence question. And the evidence that they're choosing is all over the place. It looks like it's in almost every paragraph that they're kind of pulling it from. All right, so Matthew's saying that the second paragraph, Salim, Sarah, okay, most of you are saying that based on your paragraph passage maps, the second paragraph is the best place to find information on characterization, on improving traffic. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the second passage paragraph, and I didn't create a passage map here, so this is gonna be actually a little more challenging because I'm gonna have to kind of do it visually as we go. So one of the few forces with proven ability to slow the growth of suburban sprawl has been the ultimately fine tolerance of commuters for long, annoying commutes. So ultimately finite. So it's a good one for a box. That tolerance has grown in recent decades, and not just in the United States, but it isn't unlimited. And even people who don't seem to mind spending half their day in a car eventually reach a point where finally enough is enough. Ooh, that one to me is, I would probably put a box around that because it feels like pretty powerful of like reaching a breaking point, right? That means that traffic congestion can have environmental value since it lengthens commuting times, and by doing so, discourages the proliferation of still more energy-hungry subdivisions, unless we made the congestion go away. If In a misguided effort to do something of environmental value, municipalities take steps that make long-distance car commuting faster or more convenient by adding lanes, building bypasses, employing traffic control. Okay, we're getting to the spot. Oops. We're getting to the spot where it's talking about things people have done to make cars and like things easier for cars. Employing traffic control measures make it possible for existing roads to accommodate more cars with fewer delays. Replacing toll booths, blah, 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 blah. Okay, we actually make the sprawl problem worse. Okay, that's kind of an important sentence, right? Piece of the sentence right there. Like when we're making things easier, we make the problem worse. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the question because I'm not looking at it at the same time. I've already kind of forgotten it. How would the author most likely characterize many attempts to improve traffic? Okay, so first of all, we can see that the information about the attempts to improve traffic happen right there along lines like 31 through 39, like within that space, and kind of finalizes with that those attempts make the sprawl problem worse by indirectly encouraging people to live farther away from their jobs and forcing municipalities to further extend networks and other infrastructure. Okay, so after we look at that, we can try to then build a bit of a summary of what the author, so we're having to use kind of an inference here on what the author is trying to bring across. And this, of course, is related to the author's thesis about how when you make things easier for cars, it actually makes the problems worse, right? Okay, so then I'm curious how people did on this particular question. So I'm going to pull up a poll here and see how you answered. Start pulling. So this is for question 15. And of course, the evidence, if we've already kind of found the evidence, that's also going to just be related to question 16. Okay, so the top wrong answer choice right now is A. And I can tell you that A has some red flags in it that hopefully you can kind of notice. And when you see words like doomed to fail, those are usually really extreme words. So whenever you see extreme language, things like the word tragically to me is usually, that is a flag as an extreme word. Words like that, so doomed is a pretty extreme word. And so you have to really calibrate, is the author being that dramatically negative? And the answer to this is no. I mean, when you read that paragraph, it wasn't filled with gloom and doom. It was much more practical than that and talking about, a real issue, not something so negative. So when you read really, really extreme, always, even words like always, never, extreme words like that, red flag that this is probably an incorrect answer choice. And that is the case with A. That one is incorrect. Most of you got this one right, although there was some spread around all the wrong answer choices. This one is C. Okay, so C is they are well-intentioned, but ultimately lead to environmental harm, right? And so this answer choice best describes what the author's talking about. Municipalities are trying to help people by giving them services further away from city centers. That's well-intentioned. The municipalities are trying to do positive things. But ultimately, those things lead to environmental harm because it means cars are driving longer distances, people are on the road for longer, it creates more traffic, it creates more congestion, right? So C is the best summary of what's being discussed in lines 31 through 40. So the funny thing is I didn't actually look at the line references in number 16 when I was reading back there. I just, as I was reading, I noticed that lines 31 through 40 were really the areas that were answering the question. And now that we go down and look at the choices, 31 to 40 is an option. So that one is absolutely the right answer choice here, C. So it's really hard to get the secondary question right if you didn't understand the first question. But if you are very confident about your answer choice for that question and you know where you found the information, then the evidence question should be quite a snap. Those obviously work in conjunction with each other. Okay, so we've hit our time limit. So thank you so much for your participation today. I hope that these tips will really help you as you practice your reading comprehension. I hope that you practice reading comp a little bit before we do our next test. I also want to just pull something up that's really interesting that came my way. I've learned there's a panel of grade 12 students from the Toronto area that are going to be putting on I forgot to put the date here. It's May 2nd, so it's this Saturday. So this group of current grade 12 students who have gotten into various US universities are going to be talking about their admissions experiences. So I thought that seemed like a really cool thing to share with you. It's always nice to hear from your peers and have them kind of talk through how they felt about this journey. So when you click on register there, you're going to go to a Google form and you'll see information about the group. It's called Student for Student. You can find them on Instagram as well, where they've got a couple of posts about this. They're just a fledgling student organization that's kind of looking for things to do during this COVID-19 time to try to help other students. So hopefully if you have time this Saturday morning, it's at 9 a.m. Eastern. I know that's a little early for you folks that aren't on the East Coast. You can go ahead and take a look at that. Oh, Wendy, thank you. I'm so glad to hear that reading comprehension feels less stressful now. That's great to hear. Yeah, treat it like it's a puzzle, and that you're really trying to crack open the structure that you can anticipate each time, and hopefully that'll help you improve. Hopefully you're looking forward to taking a full-length test again. All right, as usual, we're going to meet again 2 o'clock Friday. We're going to talk about math. We're going to talk about grammar, the writing and language section, and we're going to talk about the essay. Okay? You're very welcome, everybody. Thanks for your kind words, and I look forward to seeing you next session. If there's a couple, I'll come off camera and I'll answer a couple of Q&A questions if you have them there in the chat. But see you next time.